I think we can all agree that we had a really, fascinating session before on voice and leadership, which, I mean, gave me goosebumps to hear colleagues making some, really powerful remarks on how we can go forward and engage, political parties, engage, our in sort of intersectional leadership to really make progress going forward. But I'm really hoping that we can pick up on some of the trends that have been emerging throughout the conversation this afternoon in London, this morning, in other parts of the world, in this final intergenerational session. And it's really exciting to chair this session because we really try to bring together some incredibly well-known voice, such as the one that we see on the screen, Helen Clark, with some emerging voice too. And this is something that we have really reflected upon this year at ODI as something that we need to learn to do better, from our past 60 years, how we can engage emerging voices from around the world in our work, because it is actually often community-based activist organizations, that are led by young activists who are leading the way when it comes to achieving change. And that's, women's rights, as on climate change or on racial equality. So we have a lot to learn from each other. But to kick us off, we have, some reflections from an impressive career. I'm really honored, delighted to introduce our first speaker for the final session, the keynote speaker, who is a friend and someone I admire deeply personally. She was the first woman to hold the office of Prime Minister in New Zealand, also the first woman to lead the United Nations Development Programme, a serial glass ceiling breaker, the Right Honourable Helen Clark. Helen, it's such a delight to have you with us. Thank you. I know it's very early for you. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Sarah. And because it is very early, unfortunately, I haven't heard any of the discussion, but I'm sure it's been extremely stimulating. And I've been thinking, looking at some of the background thoughts that we've been sent. About the backlash. I think I sort of rose up in the political system before there was a backlash. There was just a huge wall, and you had to break through the wall. Now I think there's been a sufficient break through the wall for us to be noticed, and so there's a backlash because people don't really like you breaking through the wall. But we have to keep, sort of expanding the hole in the wall, as it were. So I'll offer some reflections along those lines. And of course, so many of the old challenges are still with us. I mean, when I say old challenges, I mean, 25 years ago in Beijing isn't so long, really. But I think we should actually be quite angry about how little in many ways has changed since Beijing. Every year I follow with interest the global gender gap report that comes out from the World Economic Forum. It must be due about now because the last one was December 2019. And when you sort of have staring at you a sort of projection that says on the current rate of progress towards a full economic equality, it will take 257 years. You think, what is this? Why are these barriers here? And I think it should, redouble our determination to do something about it. Now, on political representation, the gap is pretty slow as well. I mean, we're still seeing projections that on current trends, maybe it'll take 100 years to close them. In a way, I don't believe that because I went into the New Zealand Parliament myself in 1981. We were 9% of the Parliament was women at that time. 1981, within 18 years I was Prime Minister. You would never have projected it at that point, but sometimes things get to a tipping point where women really can't be held back, and they come through in big numbers. And I'm delighted to say that in the October election in New Zealand, the proportion of women elected went to just over 48%. So yeah, we're virtually there. We're within tiny, a millimetre away from parity, if you like, and the proportion in the cabinet has gone to 40%, and obviously that needs to rise now off the back of the women who are coming in big numbers. So it can be done, but I think where it's really slow, there is no substitute for temporary special measures, as they're called in the trade, and that means looking at the quotas, They do work. They don't have to be there forever. Women need to get established through them, and will then take their place. And I understand there's been some discussion about the role of the political parties. Political parties can be tremendously helpful or tremendously horrible in blocking women coming into political systems. So the goal has to be to change them so that they play their role in selecting and then in supporting financially women candidates, because you can't run, it's a New Zealand phrase, on the smell of a proverbial oily rag. You have to have some resources to run for political office. On the economic disparities, still, look, there is outright discrimination, but there are also a lot of structural issues which practical things can be done about, and we just have to keep on about the importance of the childcare issues. Women do 3/4 of the world's unpaid work. We wonder then why they're not in a position to advance alongside men economically. If the work was shared, it would make a difference. But because it takes longer to change deep-seated family and cultural patterns, having childcare is just absolutely critical, and societies can fund and provide for that, as they can for the time out that women need when they're having a child. That's extremely important, and full kudos to the political systems that also even make it a requirement for a father to take leave when a child is born, so that they have the experience of being helpful as well. I think one of the really glaring inequities is that women are still having to fight to have their full range of sexual and reproductive health and rights, and in a broad spectrum of countries. I mean, the United States, here we are at the end of the second decade of the 21st century. Still, women are having to fight to hang on to the constitutional benchmark of Roe versus Wade. We see in Poland, in the heart of the European Union, the restraints on women's sexual and reproductive health and rights there. And of course, we could run around the world. There are so many shameful examples. And in the context of COVID, we've seen how essential women's health services are thrown into complete disarray. The access to contraceptive supplies, access to a skilled birth attendant. We will see, when the figures eventually materialize, a rise in the unwanted pregnancies, the death in pregnancy and childbirth, because the services just weren't accessible. And I stay in close touch with midwives as a profession. They've often been the last to get the personal protective equipment as they've sought to do their work with women in the communities and in the healthcare facilities. So I think this area is just so important to continue to battle on. Sexual and gender-based violence, of course, is horrible. It's risen during the pandemic. And I think that, in societies where there was good telecommunications, people were able to ring hotlines, something could be done. But what about the many places where women were trapped with violent partners, that they and their children fearful, and there was no one to ring in a lockdown? This is a structural issue as well. So I think there's all these old challenges that haven't gone away. There are ways forward. There are solutions. We do need more committed women and men to drive them forward. And let's be honest, not every woman is a champion. And one of the things that really threatens Roe versus Wade in the US now is the fact that a woman appointee has decisively tipped the balance on the Supreme Court on these issues. So often when we talk about, we must have more women, well, actually, given the choice between a woman who's going to oppose these basic rights and a man who won't, I think, my choice is probably clear on that. It's quite exciting for me to see the new perspectives that have come forward on dealing with the gender equity issues. It's not just about gender parity. What's happening within our gender as women. We are a very diverse demographic on so many dimensions. And the reality is that within our demographic, some have been more excluded than others. So addressing issues with that intersectional perspective these days is I think the phrase is a sine qua non. I mean, it just has to happen. It's not satisfactory otherwise. What do I wish I'd known 30 years ago was one of our discussion joggers. Well, 30 years ago, I was Deputy Prime Minister of my country. So I had a certain step on the ladder, if you like. I wish I'd known actually how hard it was going to be to move it on from there. It was very hard for me to be accepted as a political level above that level. Often societies accept, oh, the woman will be the deputy, but when the women want to go to the top, that becomes quite threatening. And it wasn't easy, but it can be done. But you can't do it alone. You always need to be surrounded by your networks of supporters, and they will be women and men, just as your critics will be women and men. But we can't stand alone. We need others to stand with us. I think that persistent advocacy by growing numbers of women across decision making in New Zealand has made a difference, but one is so conscious. In so many places, women are still fighting for acceptance of the range of basic things that I've talked about in these few minutes. So it's taken a long time. We shouldn't be patient, we should be annoying women. We just have to keep at it, and we do need progress to go further and faster. So those would be some of my reflections from decades in the trenches, should we say.
That is fabulous, Helen. I mean, that's such a fantastic set of remarks to frame this this last panel. Some very concrete ideas about what we need in terms of special measures you've mentioned. We need the financial support from the childcare to making sure that women can have a political career, to the indignation that we should all collectively have for this sort of pushback on sexual and reproductive health rights, and all the challenges that you've mentioned. But the thing I take the most is this backlash that we're seeing is because we've started breaking the wall, and the patriarchy is pushing back. And so, yeah, I take your exhortation to be really angry at both the lack of progress and the backlash that is coming, where we see a little bit of progress, which should really lead us to, redouble our determination, as you said, to make sure that we see things changing and not be patient, but really wanting to see the change, and calling on our networks of support. And I couldn't agree more that not all women are part of that network of support. We need to be selective. Thank you so much for setting us up so well. We'll let you go back to have some rest, because it's very early in New Zealand. But thank you very much for sort of getting us to a great start for our final panel. Thank you. So I'll come now to someone who actually has a lot of experience campaigning on some of the areas that Helen has touched on violence against women, and on the power of grassroots community activists. So is Chamathea Fernando? Chamathea, are you there? I don't see you yet. Yes, you are. Excellent. So Chamathea is the coordinator of Stop Violence campaign in Sri Lanka. So your organization works on ending gender-based violence, something that Helen spoke about. So as a young leader, what I wanted to ask you is, you've represented girls' voices at the UN. You're part of the Beijing +25 Youth Task Force. So how is the work that you're doing challenging reductive gender norms and shattering stereotypes on what girls can do? What is your youth leadership bringing to these debates that may make us, feel that we can finally make progress?
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks for the invitation to speak here and to bring that youth perspective into the dialogue. And as very well said by Honourable Helen Clark, I think we shouldn't be patient about all of this. And this is time for us to speak out and take action. And as a girl guide myself, I have seen how non-formal education have helped me understand a lot of areas related to gender and about gender norms, about gender inequality that is existing in our society. And if not for that, I have not had didn't have that knowledge and understanding about it. And I know how it impacted me and rather, influenced some of the choices I made in my life. And I really recognize the fact that the non-formal education that supported me through Girl Guiding really influenced me to take out not only, empowering myself, but also to take that education to girls and young women everywhere. And especially working in Sri Lanka at the grassroots level, we understood that one of the biggest issues that we came across was the gender-based violence and how girls and young women were impacted by that, especially sexual harassment in public spaces. And we campaigned and we made sure that education is given to them to be able to speak out and take action by themselves, but not only stopping it to them, but also to take it to their friends and families. And having in, touching upon how non-formal education influenced me, but also not only that, we also worked on busting myths, breaking stereotypes, and also, breaking all the barriers that girls and young women have to face in life to, achieve their educational goals, to achieve career advancement, to so many other opportunities that, really prevent them because based on their gender. So we have been able to take that education to the grassroots level and give it to girls and young women. And, one thing that I've recognized over the years is the lack of leadership opportunities for young people at the decision-making table. And I think it's time for us to not really look at why it is important to have youth and women at the table, but rather how are we going to make sure that we have young people and women represented at the decision-making table. And that is something I really think should change, and we need that support to make sure that we have that representation, and not just in a tokenistic way, but to really that our voices are heard and taken into consideration. And at the same time, I feel that we also the governments need to recognize the importance of formal, but also non-formal, informal education, peer-led education for adolescents and young people, and how we can support initiatives that really directly work with these marginalized groups and communities. And at the same time, I think with the whole pandemic experience, we also saw that the world is, increasingly moving to a digitally driven world, and how this has created a digital divide. And we need to look at how we can make these platforms and spaces accessible to girls and young women to be able to, voice out their opinion, share their issues. Also, I feel that it's increasingly important to really bring the private sector and business organizations to really allocate their resources to the people that really need them, and then to really look at where we need to focus on, and maybe some of the organizations and networks that are really working at the grassroots level can, help them direct those resources to the right, the people who really need that support. And I think even that it's a very limited time that we have to speak about all of this, but one thing I want to really emphasize on is that, when we empower and educate young people, adolescents, girls, young women, even boys and young men about gender inequality, about gender-based violence, about how we together can take action to overcome this situation, it is clear that we will not only empower them, but also reach their friends, their families, their communities, and society as a whole. So my request is that, currently I'm in the Youth Task Force for Generation Equality campaign, and we have a seat in the core group, which is the decision-making body. And one thing we emphasize is bringing these adolescent and young people to the decision-making spaces and to engage them in these agenda and processes to make sure that their voices are heard and that we are able to really bring transformational solutions to some of the issues that we have. So I invite all of you to take part in this conversation and join hands with us to accelerate the achievement of gender equality in our world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amartya. That was so powerful, and you touched on some really important points in terms of how we need to mobilize the whole community. How can we can work with the whole community through education and other means to change these pervasive and problematic norms at every level. And that's something that my next speakers has been working on for decades. Professor Grace Bantabia, are you there? So Professor Grace Bantabia Kiomuhendo is a professor of women and gender study in the School of Women and Gender Studies at Makerere University in Kampala. I don't see her yet, though. You are there. Excellent. We're waiting for you to come. Are you able to join us on via video as well? Excellent.
Yeah, let me see because my internet is so good. I'll get it off.
No problem at all. So I wanted to follow up on what Chamatia has shared and really ask you to share your insights on how you think we can really make this goal of norm change sustainable. We've heard from Helen before how hard it is, how you start to make a bit of progress and then we get a backlash in return, how angry we should really be because these norms don't change deeply enough or fast enough. Have you seen laws, law enforcement make a difference in Uganda, for instance? What do you think of community outreach programs? Chamatia was talking about some of them. Do they make a difference from your experience? It'd be really useful to hear your reflection. I think we will be...
Yeah, thank you so much. Sometimes this discussion can actually make it sad. Can you hear me? I think let me put off my video so that I can be more clear. I am a product. I completed my university at the time of the Beijing, and I was a young graduate, and quickly I realized I mean there was fire, and I joined the department and the women's movement with fire. And at that time, I really had a belief, and we had a belief. And we saw change, both at the legal level in Uganda, and also the level of activism and the collective agency, different women, talking and arguing, and they were very angry, by the way. But over the years, somehow the anger has gone down, and I'm not sure why. And from the research which we did a few years ago, maybe 2 years ago, part of which was launched yesterday, is the old generation feel that because of the lack of the fire of the anger, the social norms have reinvented themselves. And if I had known many years ago that the social norms, that they are really the bedrock of advancing gender equality, maybe we would have looked at them differently. What has happened in all the areas, sexual harassment, gender-based violence, sexual and reproductive health, there is a consensus that we have moved back one step forward and 2 steps backward, and which is really a big problem. And as a person who has been researching, we see that the norms are also they are taking a different form. And you see, for instance, while we have girls educated and they are in school and they are at the university, and then the gender-based violence continues with the same group. The child care business continues with even professors. And so we ask ourselves, how much education can education transform the social norms? And now we know that it is multi-layered. We need different interventions in different areas that can make the norms shift. And we now know that somehow we focused on those norms, but I think we should also be promoting the positive behaviors. And we have an accumulation of the positive practices. We are bound to have some of these norms change. The other issue which I think is very critical is the issue of voice. And in Uganda and quite a number of countries, the collective voice is somehow, not felt as it was felt years before. And we need actually to build back on the informal networking, on the informal lobbying, on the specifically targeting structures and systems and the power holders, both formally and informal. So the informal organizing and collective voice agency has over the years gone down. And I'm glad the young generation is taking it up. And one of the other challenges which I see in addressing social norms, and which was asked in one of the seminars we had recently under the 16 days, is the data. We have data on gender-based violence, but the question we're asking in a number of our countries, who are these women? What characteristics of different women? What works for which women? And I'm glad, in this seminar, we know that there are some studies which have been done which have mapped out that. But in my country and other countries, that was the gap we have. And so even when we are mobilizing, we're still mobilizing at a broader level. And I think we're going way forward. We must have data that speaks to the situation, the different kinds of women and why they are the ones who are effective. The other point which I think is so critical, we somehow celebrated too fast in a number of years, too early actually. And when challenges like COVID, climate change, all the backlash, we are not prepared for them. For instance, COVID in my country, we were shocked that now the home became the most feared space, and yet people had to be there. GBV went up, teenage pregnancy went up, abuse went up. It was shocking. And before we thought the family was there, still. So we need to rethink. But more so, we need to really examine the layered form and manifestation of the gender norms, because they are so deeply ingrained, and they also speak to people's identity. Somehow we missed up some of the points, and I think the way forward, we need to look at that. Right now, I'm leading a project which we thought that could change something about sexual violence at the university. And we realized just giving knowledge, these are students in university, so education is really taken care of. But we realized that they need what we call life skills to empower them beyond just giving them knowledge. And also we realized that the issue of shame and stigma is important. We have put in place a system that they can report in privacy without seeing anybody, with an online system. And we hope that may help the people communicate online, but also have the skills.
I think we may have lost Grace. Grace, are you still there? I would have asked you to wrap up anyway, but can you still hear us, Grace?
I think I wasn't hearing you.
Oh, okay. So I was going to ask you to try and come to the conclusion so I can move to our next young leader.
I just concluded by saying that the men have. And I was shocked when the boys, we have these discussions with the boys, and some of the things that we believe are sexual harassment or gender violence, the boys were saying that's what makes them men. And that was a shock. I'll stop here for now. And we need to really investigate that and maybe bring on board boys and men in this discussion. Thank you.
That's such a powerful point on which to reflect. And with that, I'm really, you stressed throughout your intervention the importance of looking at all the layers and working at all the levels, so that we can really, try and shift these norms. And our next speaker is Steve Lee, who is somebody who is really trying to work at different levels and really addressing the different layers. So Steve is the operating partner at the UN Major Group for Children and Youth, but he's also the executive director of a youth-led foundation for environmental stewardship. He's conducted interviews with thousands of marginalized voices from indigenous communities across Canada. And so Steve works, both in an intersectional way, across communities, but also on the very cogent issue of climate change. So Steve, I was going to ask you really how you think we can ensure that these intersectional issues, particularly indigenous rights, women's rights, are considered, in our work, and especially on the climate crisis that we know has compounded challenges for women, for remote communities, for indigenous communities. How can we make sure that they can be, supported to realize their rights?
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah, and it's a pleasure to be here. From time to time, I get looped back into the great work that fellow Canadians are doing, and it's a great pleasure to join an event by the Government of Canada and ODI. My name is Steve. I've spent the last several years traveling across Canada to over 500 high schools and universities, colleges, and in over 400 towns, mainly in rural and remote communities, including a little over 40 Indigenous communities as well. I'm also mindful that Zoe is on the call, who will be speaking on the Indigenous rights more in the Canadian context, so I won't belabor the point too much. But what I found in visiting all the schools, having met with over 100,000 students across Canada, directly meeting them and speaking with them, we did this under the banner of what's called the 3% Project. And we purposely went into communities that don't want to talk about climate change, don't want to talk about sustainable development, don't want to talk about gender equality and other issues. And that's how we identified the communities and purposely went into them and had very much a well-researched and catered communication to that audience. How do we bring this kind of intersectional, integrated understanding to not only gender equality, but overall the 2030 agenda for a more inclusive, equitable, fair, and sustainable, prosperous future? I think it really has to do with the question of what is the story of the future? And I guess I actually don't know if this is a particularly a Canadian audience conversation, but generally, what is the story of the future? Because I don't think people have a good idea or a collective understanding of the future that we want to have or what that future ought to be. And more importantly, how do I see myself in the part of the story to make it happen? Yuval Harari, who's written the book Sapiens as a historian, he recently noted that people around the world are feeling this frustration, even if their material conditions are relatively good, that they feel like the world is moving on without me, and the change is happening to me. All the time, there is these, throughout history, when there's a depiction of the future, regular people, common people were always part of that story, where it's propaganda posters or stories told by dictators or even by citizens. It was always common people who were part of the future and leading that future. That's no longer the case. We see big ideas and big words like machine learning, genetic engineering, blockchain, globalization, and I'm not part of that. We're no longer part of the story of the future. So if I try to understand and to connect with the deep resentment of people in many places around the world, a part of what might be going on there is that the future doesn't need me. We have all these smart people in California and New York and Beijing that are planning this amazing future with AI and global connectivity and everything, and they don't need me. So if they're nice, they might throw some crumbs my way later on, but at the end, psychologically, it's much worse to feel that you're useless than to feel that you're exploited. So, what does this have directly to do with, gender equality or climate action? All these things, at the end of the day, it's not so much, what are we trying to protect? What are we trying to build? What are we trying to actually look forward to, as opposed to all these bad things are going to happen to you if you don't do something. That's generally the messaging around climate action as well. That's generally the messaging, at least to men who are deeply entrenched in patriarchy. It feels like it's a threat to us. It's a threat to men. And it really has to, the storytelling has to be on what is the future that I can be a part of, that I want to be a part of. And that storytelling, I find, is really what a lot of the marginalized communities that are on the fringes on this seem to be feeling.
Thank you so much, Steve. That's really powerful, this storytelling about the future. It's easy, Helen was saying that before, how angry we should really be. For years we've been trying to make this progress. We don't see that coming, and if you don't see this future really coming together, it can become really daunting at every level. And in fact, this connects me very well to the next speaker, to Roberta Clark, who can reflect more on the importance of visioning this future, this storytelling. Roberta is the acting general director for East and Southern Africa of UN Women, and has a lot of experience in driving these gender affirmative and inclusive policy initiatives at international level, which has been doing a lot of leverage in diplomacy to navigate these political environments where political change should occur. But Roberta, we just heard from Steve, but we heard from Helen before as well. Many of us have been hearing, for decades how, despite all our unrelenting efforts to see this change is just not coming fast enough, or if it comes, then there is this big pushback. And in fact, some of our young leaders have obviously been hearing that for all their lives. So what do you think? I mean, obviously, a large part of continuing to go ahead, as Helen was saying, to find this determination means that we have to find the resilience and the support. She was talking about the networks, to swim against the tide. So as a successful woman leader, in your field, what advice do you have for our young leaders? How can they navigate these goals, in a space where the personal is also political?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Can you all hear me well? Yes?
Yes, very well.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. And really also appreciating the contributions of the colleagues before me, the panelists before me, the activists before me. I guess, like Grace, I want to start off with a little bit of a personal reflection on. So I came to my activism in what I call the warm glow of the community effect of the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, with its focus on law reform, on policy reform, and on transformation of practices and social norms. And I think in my generation, there was quite a bit of focus on the potential of law and law reform to end discrimination and to advance empowerment and social justice. And so I think it was then and still is a defensible focus, as law is such an expression of social values. Law sets the tone for how the state treats its people and how people treat each other. And so equality in law is crucial to gender equality. And I think it's because of that all over the world, and certainly in the Caribbean where I'm from, that feminist activists really took to law reform as, I think, almost their primary focus of activism. And a lot of change came out as a result of this activism, and I think Laurel spoke about that before. And in particular, changes in relation to ending violence against women. But we also had changes in labor law, maternity leave, if you think about it, aspects of social protection, in some events, some cases, movement of the sexual and reproductive rights. But perhaps I think our successes were most apparent in ending violence against women law reform. And it's always been something that has intrigued me to think about why have we been so successful in this area and less successful in other areas. And I think it has something to do, I think, with political economy as well. Those of us there's something that's, I don't want to say homogenizing, but the language of ending violence against women, the language of our activism was that violence against women, it touches all women and girls, or all women and girls are vulnerable to some degree of this expression of inequality. And I think that kind of was a unifying voice that brought women across their diversity together. So it was really a very plural movement to have a concerted and clear call for state accountability to change the laws. What has happened, of course, since then is that we found that legal change perhaps was the easy part. And in a previous panel and in the breakout room, there was a lot of conversation about what else was needed besides law reform. And we do know in the Women Law and Development Framework that apart from the law, we do need to also address the procedural components, the administration of justice. We need better trained judges, better trained judicial officers who also understand the plurality of women's experiences, women and girls' experiences, also men and boys' experiences. We need greater efficiency in policing and in court processes. And we certainly need people, women and girls, men and boys, to understand the purpose and intent of the changes that are being made and to think and act in the language of respect for common humanity and human rights for all. So some achievements, but it is, of course, a rather incomplete agenda. And I think there's a lot to be done still on the law reform side. But not only law reform, I think we have to get to what our sister Anne-Marie Getz calls the deep politics of culture. I mean, she has this language of the high politics of state, which is where law reform and policy reform are situated. But now we also need to ground those social understandings in cultural expression and to be working at all levels. Now, so it's the where we work and how we work that we have to be thinking about. And also working in ways that are integrated. Someone spoke about it earlier. How do we have our activism that's more joined up? So that we don't just have end violence against women activism here, women's political participation activism there, environmental justice activism somewhere else. Somehow these movements have to come together because what we really need is that movement. And so I think what I have sort of been learning as I go along, because you never fully learn it, you keep learning it, in relation to activism, is that you have to understand what has come before you and who has done what before you. And you have to build on that. You have to fix the gaps or address the gaps, fix the weaknesses, and you have to bring your own, you have to continue the strengths, and you have to bring your own energies and I would say anxieties to the work of activism. I think that's really very important. And we have to be thinking about extending our partnerships in a rather intentional way. And as I said, partnerships also across thematic areas. I don't know that we have any luxury now to be working in compartments. The existential challenges are so real. The inequalities challenges are so real. And those inequality challenges are also rather existential for all of over the half of the world's population that are living in grinding poverty, getting worse on a daily basis in the context of COVID and the retreat of the state because of declines in revenue. So we really have to be thinking about this joined up activism. And social media is really important, but we have to also understand in many of our countries, while social media offers us a voice, an amplification of a voice that we never had before, it also does not touch so many people. In my region, in one of our countries, maybe Jamaica, for example, the internet penetration is only at maybe 50% of the population. So we know that to get to the cultural change that we need to get to, we have to get into communities. And I want to really endorse, I can't remember, it was a panelist from before who spoke about the centrality of the education system. So we have to stop teaching to the test and teaching to values in a much more structured way. Teaching to empathy and equality, all those things have to be embedded in our education system. And working with early childhood education as well, doing curriculum reform, teacher training, all of those things are really essential to social norms. By the time we get, thinking about the law reform trajectory in the context of violence against women, that's already when social norms have been fully formed. So we have to think more deeply and act more intentionally on the prevention side of the work that we're doing. The backlash is real. I would say that we've seen it at a transnational level, and it pops up with every sort of global conference that we have. It pops up annually at the Commission on Status of Women, that kind of, you know, almost mimicking the women's movement in a sense. So you have a coalition of forces who have one common value despite their differences and their diversities of political agendas, but they share this resistance to women's autonomy. They're mobilizing all the time, and they're active all through the year. So we have to really understand where that resistance is coming from and how it is organized, and we have ourselves to be responding to that. Having said all of that, I am an optimist by nature, and I think that we have made significant progress, and the feminist movement is so much larger than it was 15, 20, 30 years ago. And it's not just a feminist movement, it's on environmental justice as well, and on socioeconomic justice. So I think that we're seeing that. If you ask me what I should know, what I should have known 30 years ago, I think what I should have known then, and I still need to know it, is what is that language that we need to employ to get to the root of men's resistance to equality. There's something there, I think, in our articulation that we have to get at, and it's hard. It's a very hard place. It's not a wall, but it is a barrier, and we have to figure out how we speak to that much more strongly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roberta. That was, wow, so powerful. I hope my next speaker can answer partially your last question, but I think I also want to pick up on the really important point you make about really bringing together with these siloed movements that we have created. I mean, I was really struck last year when we organized before the Nairobi conference, you know, on the Cairo Plus 25, a high-level roundtable on sexual and reproductive health rights in crisis settings, humanitarian settings, and there was a sub-community of activists there that clearly just speak to one another most of the time, and then on the side there were the more kind of mainstream humanitarian kind of community, or the mainstream women's rights community that never really joined the dots or met together. So that is really urgent for us to think how we really break through silos that we have created. You know, we'll only act to slow down the progress that we can collectively make. But let me come to Sagar Sachdeva, who has been working to bring, you know, men to become really advocates and champions of women's rights. It's fantastic what you're doing, Sagar. You know, the work you're doing in India to really try and challenge these established norms around masculinity, how they impact on the treatment of women and girls is inspirational. And so I really like you to talk to us about what you think has been most effective when it comes to engaging with men and boys, you know, in social movements to address, you know, these really rigid and, you know, potential sort of harmful expectations around, you know, how men and boys should behave, you know, towards themselves, towards each other, and around women and girls. As you know, we've heard before from the experience of Uganda, Grace was saying there are some behaviors that almost assume to reinforce, you know, the concept of masculinity, which are obviously, you know, very abusive behaviors. So yeah, what should we do collectively, and what are you doing that we can learn from?
Okay, thank you so much, Sarah, for having me here. And yeah, so I'll try to keep it brief, but I'll speak to this question from two perspectives. One is a little bit conceptual, but I'll also come to a little bit of more practical approaches that we have been trying. So this question comes up a lot, that we need to work with men and boys, and how do we go about it? I think what would be a good beginning point to enter this question would be to understand the need to talk about masculinities and developing a masculinities framework from which we start doing this work. And what I mean by that is that building an intersectional masculinities framework that accounts for multiple experiences of the young men and boys that we want to speak to. So as in feminist principles, we have understood that gender is not the only identity that informs women's experiences, but many other identity positions such as ethnicity, race, caste, class, and so many other things that are informing different kinds of marginalizations, different kinds of daily experiences. With men also, that holds true. However, that kind of understanding of say masculine norms being formed around the lines of not just gender, but also say in my context, caste is a major informant of masculinities, religion is a major informant of masculinities, and the kind of norms of performance that men have amongst each other along those lines, these kind of things don't see themselves, or these principles don't see themselves translating into actual programming and conversations. What we will see in these conversations is that there is a lot of conversation that is being held with men and boys around gender. But is that conversation something that the men and boys in the room relate to? So from, say, understanding many years ago that we need to bring the boys into the room, we've brought them in, but we also need to now talk about realities that are true to their experiences. And this is based on some kind of research we've done and some kind of programming that we're trying to build right now, is to understand that many times there are norms amongst men which perpetuate violence even amongst men that create positions of privilege as well as vulnerability. So while we all know that men enjoy an immense amount of privilege within patriarchal structures vis-a-vis all the other genders, there are also many, the sense of vulnerability or insecurity that exists within the masculinities framework, a lot of times even constructed insecurities, is how the framework actually perpetuates. So a basic example of that in my context would be, say, a man from an upper caste majority religion. And this is something that I think happens in many countries, is that feels a threat from a minority community or from an immigrant community or a minority religion, and specifically a threat from the men of that minority, that they're going to somehow take away our women. And while treating the women of a community as objects, also treats the men as a threat to one's own self-image and masculinity. And that's what perpetuates that violence. So I think at one point it's very important that we bring these conversations to men and boys and not just stay limited to the understanding of gender, but also talk to them about gender in the context of how it works with religion, how it works with caste, and what are the pertinent identities informing their daily lives. And these kind of identities affect every single thing in their daily lives. Choices of partners, choices of how they maintain sexual relationships, what kind of friends they make. Friendship networks are formed around identities amongst men, which are not just about the gender. Sexual orientation, sexuality are things that inform these decisions. So it is this kind of intersectional approach that we advocate for when we're speaking to men and boys. And in terms of the approach, also, we have seen that a lot of times when a programming tries to follow, say, a very preachy kind of an approach, that these are the 5 things you should not do as a man, and these are the 5 things you should be doing as a man to be more gender equitable, that kind of conversation seems to have much less impact. For the very reason that it is a threatening conversation to somebody who already enjoys some privilege and then doesn't have enough reason to get into that conversation. So therefore, it has very low impact. So what we're also trying to do is we're trying to build pedagogies that are more reflective in nature, which offers people to choose for themselves whether or not they want to engage with certain content, and gives them many options in what ways they want to engage with certain ideas and concepts, and then apply it to their own lives. So this kind of transformative approach, what it also tries to do is not really, and going back to how the conversation started, not to create champions for women's rights and champions for gender equality, but people who just want to take a transformative approach to their own lives, to their own personal relationships, and try to see if they can make a change to just make things more equitable for themselves, to address the insecurities and anxieties that they face regarding feminism, regarding gender equality. And if they start addressing those as well, the end product would be gender equitable relationships. So for them, they are not just basically perpetrators or partners for women's rights, but actual participants in the gender equality movement. And that's the transition to allyship happens after that. Once they start doing this, they automatically we all start becoming allies. And a little bit of it comes from personal journeys as well, and a little bit from the men that I've been working with have felt these effects. I would end on just a very brief point, is that building this kind of intersectional masculinities also has the advantage of addressing the kind of intersectional movements that we are looking at. So if we address masculinities in this way, what we also end up doing is that we address a lot of larger issues like fascism. So if we see any kind of fascist regime rising in the world, in any country or any space, we see that those regimes necessarily perpetuate as well as bank on the kind of masculinities and the masculine norms that exist within different communities. So the example of majority and minority men feeling a threat coming from the minority, which is actually generally perpetuated by fascist regimes. So we automatically also start attacking those tools of those kind of regimes if we start addressing masculinities in this way. And the similar example can be then extended to climate justice, for example, where climate change denial comes from, is seen as a much more masculine thing, and working on sustainable development is generally seen as more feminine and therefore looked down upon. So these kind of attitudes exist across the board in different kinds of movements that we're working in. So masculinities framework can actually, in an intersectional way, work across movements if we start thinking like that. So that's just like a few thoughts I had to share today. Thank you.
Very useful, very important thoughts, Sagar, and it builds on what both Helen and Roberta were saying, how we really bring together these networks in a different way, how we break the silos, bring a masculinity frameworks, look at this intersectionality that in a way has not been throughout. If you think about Beijing, there was a dominant narrative that really didn't see the other points of view the same way, and perhaps has slowed down the progress that we could have achieved if that lens had been there from the beginning. So it's an important point to reflect as we wrap up the proceedings of the seminar or the conference going forward. Let me come to our final speaker, who is a First Nations community educator. Zoe Roy is going to talk to us about how the importance of weaving the art, and especially the spoken word, in her work with young people, to address the kind of issues we've been discussing throughout this half day that we've been together. So Zoe, just for you to conclude, what would you say has been the role of the arts in your education work? How have you used that to really influence hearts and minds to try and drive more equitable and just societies?
Well, I am very grateful to be here. My name is Zoe Roy. I'm Cree Dene Métis, a member of Peter Ballantyne Cree Nation in northern Saskatchewan. I am a first-generation survivor of the colonial legal system and a second-generation survivor of the residential school system here in Canada. And I think my perspective is unique, but definitely contributes to this whole conversation. I've been very enlightened by the rest of the panelists and this whole conference. I want to talk about, like, in my work, in the past week, actually, I defended my thesis. So in my bio, it says that I have still in my master's program, but I defended my thesis. And what I really want to say about this is that I'm very glad that I have operated on the periphery of mainstream Canada. And I did that in order to maintain my autonomy. At an early age, I very rightly so developed a mistrust of the Canadian government due to the nature of my environment, my family, the stories that informed my identity is largely due to the resistance my family had of the Canadian government. But what this did is it informed me that I was simply an Indigenous person, a socially constructed Indigenous person that is living within the confines of a colonial state. And I needed to be a human first in order to cope and live, because I was like, my life cannot be a mistake. My life is on purpose. It just so happens that the world doesn't understand the importance of my life. And I knew this wasn't a coincidence. And it is through art and storytelling and poetry and creating a safe space amongst kids that I realized that is really our humanity that we are trying to define. We are trying to understand our own humanity in a very competitive world. And I think that art fundamentally really helps us understand the nuances of our humanity. However, we cannot tell Indigenous youth to believe in themselves and expect the system to change. One of the problems that we face as Indigenous youth is that colonial interventions is still the main mechanism for dealing with risk amongst Indigenous groups. We are dismantling the families in the name of, you know, eliminating risks amongst these target populations. But I really do believe that we need our family. We need people who we connect to be close to us. And I think that is important. However, our ability to forgive people around us is limited by, you know, these colonial interventions, by, you know, how we're informed of who we are in our school systems, or the normalization of kids in child welfare, or the normalization of Indigenous men in jails, in institutions. And then we leave Indigenous women as dependents. We don't actually expect Indigenous women to maintain full-time jobs, to take care of the home, and to give the kids, you know, an experience like the rest of Canada. We are socially excluded in many ways from extracurricular activities, building healthy social relationships with other Canadians that would help us delve into the intersectionality of Canada. That social exclusion definitely lays on the back of Indigenous women, particularly in the time of COVID. We see that mental health crisis, or what we're defining as mental health crisis, I define as an emotional health crisis, is really weighing down on our women, because these are the people who are the glue of the families. And we see so many people who are suffering from isolation, suffering from the lack of being heard, or being loved, or being involved. A lot of this is falling on the backs of Indigenous women. I'm particularly concerned about the emotional health and well-being of women. And I am enlightened by this conversation because I see hope, and I'm informing you that the social isolation of Indigenous women goes far beyond this COVID crisis. This is a norm. And we don't have the luxury of the internet. Indigenous women are just as intersectional, or just as diverse, than as all women. And I am here as a speaker because I weave through all of the things that you have to weave through in order to get to a place like this. And I don't speak on behalf of all Indigenous women, because we are not a homogenous group. But I am coming here as a survivor of the colonial legal system and telling you systemic intervention is one of the main problems that our families are facing. And I am afraid that the next generation of girls today are inheriting, I wrote it down, let me just, systemic intervention contributes to the dismantling of Indigenous spirits, families, and nations, which will only reproduce the inequities that little Indigenous girls are unknowingly inheriting today. These little girls are in kindergarten. They need us to be champions for them, and I know that we're going to do that together. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Wow, Zoe, thank you so much. Helen concluded her remarks with the importance of bringing the intersectional perspective. I am sorry that she's not here to hear how powerfully you brought that out in terms of how much more intentional we all collectively need to be, you know, going forward, thinking of what it means, you know, to advocate, you know, for gender equality, for women's rights, when they clearly, you know, sort of the women are disadvantaged in so many different ways, depending on where they come from, who they are. But yeah, some really powerful stuff to take with us. We'll come back to you just in a few minutes, but first I'm gonna hand over to my colleague Caroline, who is going to have the impossible task, really, to try and recap the main points. Some of the key messages have been coming out of the discussion today. I don't know how you're going to do this, Caroline, because I have got all this stuff buzzing in my head. But yeah, I really want to sort of pause and take it in more deeply and really reflect on, you know, this powerful conversation that we've had today. I've had a look at the jump board. There is so much there, but I think there is a lot that we can then sort of mull over and take forward, you know, so as sort of proceedings from the documents. But please try and take us through your takeaways.
Okay, thank you, Sarah, for that. I'm just going to share this again, hopefully as a little bit of a skeleton for people to think about. So some of the language that I heard a lot today was about gender norms, and these are about the attitudes and behaviors that we all carry, and they cover intersectional issues as well. And we used to talk about gender norms as a separate bucket. So we'd talk about education, or we'd talk about economic empowerment, and then we talk about gender norms over here somewhere. And actually what we've heard today is that discriminatory norms, attitudes and behaviors are embedded in everything. And that's a really important lesson, that we need to work with hearts and minds and institutions. So we talked a lot today about these forces of change which go upwards. And what I heard today was some unifying sort of change movements. We heard about struggle, we heard about innovation, and we heard about persistence. We heard about action at multiple levels. At the bottom of this chart, the norm maintainers, such as violence, action on violence, to actually allow people to change their norms, through to the institutional structures of power, which operate at a higher level, but are also embedded with discriminatory norms. So on violence, I'm just going to say one thing really. A young activist was asked, are you hopeful about changing violent misogyny? And her response was, it's less that I'm hopeful, it's more that I'm intolerant. I demand change. On political power, we heard about women exercising political power every day, but they don't get the desk, they don't get the money, and they don't get the authority. And we heard about moving from fighting to win to what women do in politics, which is govern and lead, and how we move to a very different form of politics. We heard about intersectionality throughout. I don't think there was one session that I was in which didn't bring this to the forefront. And actually, I think this is one of our future challenges. It's really come into the mainstream in the last 5 years. And it's clearly something that we have to work on. We heard about feminist movements being the most important drivers of change over the past 25 years. In 1975, most countries did not have a feminist movement. By 2015, most countries had a feminist movement. This is feminist success. And this takes us back to the long view. If we're talking about 1975, 1995, what do I wish I'd known 30 years ago? 10 years after I started working in this business, I was really frustrated. I couldn't see any change happening. 15 years after I'd started working, I was almost ready to give up. I just didn't think change was going to happen. After 25 years, I could see that some change had happened. So what I wish I knew was that actually I had to have hope and trust in the future, and I had to be patient. And this, I think, ties into what we heard from Steve Lee. What does the future look like in 30 years' time? And it's sobering how many feel excluded. And we know that many, many feel very excluded. And we've heard this also from Zoe. But actually being able to listen to those voices and hearing those voices is really important for everyone. If we don't hear them, and if we don't name the problems, then they remain invisible. Just like patriarchy remains invisible if we don't name it. I just wanted to finish really on a small anecdote myself about hope for the future. This is before the lockdowns, really, where we've had some really tough years, and I won't pull any punches on the impact of Trump globally and how that has made many feminist activists feel. We've had problems in Europe. We have populism. And I have to say, I felt very disillusioned. And then I went to one of the school strikes for climate activism held in London. And for the first time, I felt really hopeful about the future. I saw these utterly inspiring young people out there with loads of energy and actually doing what our young people on the panel today have said. They were demanding change. And I think what I've heard today in this panel is learning from both the experienced and from the youth activists today. It's been inspirational. And I think what it shows is that together we have an intergenerational effort that ultimately will lead to change.
Thank you so much, Caroline. Well done, you, to sort of summarize so brilliantly what was, yeah, a lot of really powerful stuff to mull over. Before we close, I first of all want to thank Chamatia, Grace, Steve, Roberta, Sagar, and Zoe for being fantastic panelists on the last panel, and of course Helen, who is no longer with us, but sort of really got us off to a great start for the final discussion. All the proceedings, all the discussions we've had today will also to come together in a digital goodie bag, as my colleagues are calling it. That's going to be sent out after the conference. But before I fully draw this incredible half a day to a close, I want to come back to Zoe and really end hearing from her, who's going to share an original piece of poetry that's been exclusively written for the conference today. So Zoe, over to you. For the closing poem.
Okay, great. Here's the poem. We are the wonders of the world. Whatever it takes, we'll make it work. We are caretakers of the earth. We're warriors for all people, defenders of all that's life. We will not be pushed aside. Women are transcenders of greatness. We're sacred. Women are patient. Sometimes some of us are late, but we more than make it. Women are valued to be valued because we're valuable. Women are the foundation. Listen, we're not malleable. Women have character and we come in all shapes and sizes. Women are resilient. We persevere, rain or shine. Women endure struggle, and at most times it's silent, but women are courageous. Yes, women give me guidance. Women are leaders. We're multi-talented, complex. Yes, women are the boss without having to flex. Yes, women are storytellers, story keepers, teachers. Women are community builders, insightful believers. Catalysts, you are all my sisters. Women are an inspiration. Women are life givers, a majestic yet perfected creation. Women are elevating and we elevate each other. Yeah, we're independent, but we still need our brothers. Women are powerful and we carry a voice, and we'll hold our position till it's time to make noise, 'cause we are the wonders of the world. Whatever it takes, we'll make it work. We are caretakers of the earth. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I'm speechless. It's going to be hard to close this and follow you, Zoe. Thank you so much. That was inspirational, motivational. It's a fantastic way to end the day, give us the energy to keep fighting, to keep pushing for our rights to be upheld and to see the progress that we absolutely are entitled to see. Thanks, Zoe. It's also a reminder that arts often can be overlooked, in foreign affairs, in development discussions, but they're actually a really important tool to help change hearts and minds of people. But with that amazing closing from Zoe, let me just thank you all for such a fantastic half a day that we've spent together. Thank all the fabulous experienced women leaders, young activists, gender experts that have attended and contributed to the discussion today. Thank you to the fantastic Global Affairs Canada team that's been helped shape what has been an incredible program of discussion, of interaction, of reflection, of thinking together. And thank you to my team, to Caroline, to Rachel, to Zoe, to Carrie, Julia, David, all the others that you don't see in the background, for making this discussion, this day, of reflection and future action, possible. And thank you for staying until now. Digital fatigue is real at the end of a very challenging year that we've all had. So thank you. As I was saying before, we will be circulating, a digital goodie bag with all the relevant materials that we've discussed today. The new report that Caroline has talked about from the Align project at ODI, and all the reflections that we're going to take from today. If you're interested in continuing the conversation around issues of inequality, through the lens of universal coverage for financing, we have the next ODI 60 conference in January, on the 13th of January. The title is Global Reset, Time for a New Social Contract. If you're interested, let the team know, and they'll sign you on for the next conference. But let me just close by wishing all of you a happy, healthy, festive season, a joyous 2021, where we can hopefully meet each other again, continue working together to change what is long overdue in seeing the rights of all women upheld with dignity and equally. Thank you very much.